Shall we begin, ma'am?
Yeah.
Jajalapa, namaste, good evening, everyone. Welcome to yet another interesting SONA webinar series. My name is Anusha Sakya, currently studying 5th year bachelor's in architecture from Thapatali campus. And today I'll be moderating this session by architect Jayendra Dos Sunuwar sir on this fascinating topic, state of architecture, organized by Society of Nepalese Architects Committee of Architecture Education. SONA has been organizing these amazing webinars with very interesting series of topics which have been quite fruitful for all of us. And today's session, we have with us President of SONA, respected architect Rajesh Thapa sir, Vice President and Coordinator of Committee of Architecture Education, Architect Sunita Subedi ma'am, General Secretary of SONA, Architect Apil Casey sir, and the Chairperson of SONA Committee of Architecture Education, Architect Pradeep Adhikari sir. I would also like to welcome all of the experts, seniors, juniors, and fellow friends from different backgrounds and from the same field of architecture joining us from Zoom and SONA Facebook Live. Welcome to the webinar all of you once again. Our schedule for today's session is likewise. First, we have opening speech by General Secretary of SONA, Architect Apil Casey sir. Then we move into the core of today's session, presentation by our speaker, Architect Jayendra Dos Sunuwar sir, on the topic State of Architecture. Then we will have short and quick question and answer session about the topic. After that, Chairperson of SONA, Committee of Architecture Education, Architect Pradeep Adhikari sir will have few words with us. And finally, we will end our today's session with conclusive remarks by our President of SONA, Architect Rajesh Thapa sir. Well, speaking about today's hot topic, state of architecture, the title itself is very general topic for all of us, yet so engaging and intriguing. This reminds me of famous quote by Norman Foster as he says, as an architect, you design in the present with the awareness of the past for the future, which is essentially unknown. And this raises so many questions in mind about where are we right now as an architect and what kind of educational basis we have made till now and how are we doing in this field of architecture and so much more. Being an architecture student myself, I am looking forward to gain some insights about state of architecture in present context by listening to our outstanding speaker, Architect Jayendra Dos Sunuwar sir. So before that, moving forward with today's webinar, I would humbly like to request General Secretary of SONA, Architect Apil Casey sir, to say few words for us. The platform is yours, sir.
Thank you, Anushka, for such a wonderful opening session. And I'd like to congratulate Architecture Education Committee's coordinator and Vice President of Society of Nepalese Architects, Sunita Subedi ma'am, and Chairman of the subcommittee, Pradeep Adhikari sir, to initiate this wonderful topic, which is rather a vague topic to discuss, the state of architecture, but very much aligned with the state is very much aligned with the vision and the goal of 14th Executive Committee set forward. On behalf of 14th Executive Committee, Society of Nepalese Architects, I'd like to welcome all of you who are joining us in this June session from the Zoom webinars and also from the live sessions from Facebook and other social media. This has been one of the sixth session for our continuous webinar season. But the program initiated by the Education Committee is one of its first kind to critically review the modern architecture of Nepal in its critical perspective. I'd like to thank Pradeep sir and Sunita ma'am once again to organize this kind of event, which aligns the academia, practice, and research of architecture in its whole sum. It is also important to gather, collect, and communicate and promote the Nepalese architecture through this form of dialogue to bring people from the different background or even the architecture practice with a different critical perspective. I'd like to thank all of the members of the SONA who continuously push us to come up with such programs. And we wish to come up with some critical perspective on practice of the Nepalese architecture through the research and the different dynamics of like in education and other communication too. So with this note, I'd like to, with the permission of our President Rais Thapa, I'd like to request Anusha to start today's session, and I very much look forward to participate in the program as a listener and make a comment, or if where I'd like to learn something from Jayendra sir as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for your inspiring and kind words. Now it's time for the main entree of today's session. Speaking about today's spokesperson, he is the director and lead architect at Jayendra and Partners (JAP), also the consulting architect at Ratana and Safe of Kathmandu. Having educational background of architecture in late 90s from Institute of Engineering, Pulchok Campus (TU), and bachelor's in fine arts in architecture and filmmaking, Massachusetts College of Art and Design, Boston. He's been also contributing in field of teaching at Himalaya College of Engineering, Lalitpur, as design studio and theory teacher, also been presenting as guest lecturer in Pulchok campus. So without any delay, let's welcome our humble and insightful speaker of today's event, architect Jayendra Dos Sunwar, sir. And just a quick reminder, we have a question and answer session right after this, so be free to give any questions in the comment section. The platform is all yours, sir. Thank you.
Okay, namaskar. Well, I hope the session will, will be uninterrupted. And we have to rely on this technology. And, there's nothing that we can do. And we're all also not well versed on all these things. So, good things are happening, connecting all these people. And, surprisingly, I'm connected too. So, I'll try to start without any further delay. So we're it's a series of that SONA has initiated, and the first one is state of architecture, which is how we are. Architecture is in a way state, that precedes all state. So I think we should start without further delay. I'll share the screen and so let me go to this view thing, okay? Slideshow thing. Okay, here we go. So it's state of architecture, and there was a bit small summary which you must have read, or so we're going to talk about the main content. Anyway, so I want to start with the let's begin with the beginning. Yeah. So this is the picture of the house that I grew up, and it's my old house in Batisputali. And it's my father's motorbike parked in the corner, and it's me and my sister. My sister leaning to the double post wooden column, and it was south facing Dalan, and I've I would say now fond memory of that Dalan because of those columns. It had a very interesting tactile, even as a child, I could feel the like the weathering of the wood, and with this black matte finish, and this carving and its sturdiness. And so this Dalan was an interesting place. We would often hop in this motorbike and go for a virtual joy ride. And at one point it even fell on my sister, and after this much commotion, no harm was done. And on the other side of the picture is my father and mother, holding their kids. And in the background is the Dalan, with the column, capital, and the lintel. So, okay, that's, it's not like how I got started in architecture, but, after studying architecture, it's interesting to go back and try to, like, frame your memory, like, make sense of all those things that, you had passed. If I had been a nuclear scientist, maybe I wouldn't have cared much about all these things. But, it just so happened that I studied architecture, and there are so many things that started becoming meaningful. Like, so, this part of the talk is like, I've said like, walking with Nepali vernacular. Okay, so that was the Dalan I grew up in, but especially my father's, my father was in police force, and I was in third grade, going to school in this swanky school, laboratory school designed by Steincher Jinpo, you know. And from Kathmandu, I was transported to Nepalganj, Western Nepal. And suddenly, next moment, I was sitting in the ground under the mango grove, and, and a blackboard on stand, and, sitting under the sky, and this class was like conducted under the sky, under the mango grove. So it was a very drastic shift, going to Nepalganj. And, but that time, Nepalganj was, surprisingly, like, it almost came across as much more developed in Kathmandu in a sense, because all of the houses were like cement plaster and column and concrete, whereas, in Kathmandu, most of the houses were like brick exposed, geometry roof and wooden and everything. Like, so that was very strange to go to Nepalganj, like see all this almost like developed town kind of thing. So wide street, so all that, but lots of dust. But, so Nepalganj was interesting in so many ways, those, tajia and like, like fishing in the paddy field and all those things. But, more than anything that I remember, I have a fond memory of like on my way to school, there was like, we would pass through the, potter's like workshop kind of thing. And it was very interesting to see him make this pot, And the thing was like, in Nepal, they make, the gagro, water, vessel, which is like more roundish, like not as like, jar like as in Kathmandu. So what they used to do was like, they would like first, make ready the bottom half part of the jar and put it in the wheel, and then later on add the top part of this thing. I think it was done because otherwise it would just collapse or something like that. So that time I thought that was really unfair, that was not true like pottery kind of thing. But anyway, that was, I would spend like hours looking at those potter making. It was very, very interesting. But anyway, so after that, we got transferred to Pokhara. And in Pokhara, on my way to school, it was very strange to see this old Pokhara bazaar like Kathmandu, so there was another Kathmandu, not in Kathmandu, so that was very interesting. And so, later on I came, I did my SLC and like went to Opulcho campus, and I trained as a draftsperson, and I started working. And my first job was at ML Kaista, and that office is memorable in one sense that in his office, he had this huge bookcase full of all these architecture books. And one of the books that I still very clearly remember was Oscar Niemeyer's Brasilia, So it was very interesting to see those columns and all those buildings. So I was very excited to see those things. But anyway, so that was memorable about Emil Kaista. But another thing was, we would really laugh at this, foreign guy, architect from USAID would come to, this office and carry his bicycle all the way to, Emil Kaista's office. That was really funny. I mean, of course, he was scared that somebody would steal his bike. But anyway, then I was working different from including BDA, where it so happened that, they were doing like some project on Buddhist monastery, and it was really interesting to see also the rigid form of planning, and very, very determined ornamentation and all those things. So inclined, like tapering windows and all these things. So that was another interesting thing that happened while I was working in BDA with the Tom Cruise and Rajaram. And after that, it so happened, I end up working for the same guy that we used to laugh while at Kaista's office. David O'Brien was his name, and I would term that working with David O'Brien as a cultural chef. I was a draftsman, okay? And, the first day of the office is very memorable because, there was only two of us, and our desk was like just, next to each other. And in between us, there was a small cassette tape recorder. And, and he played this classical music all day long. And I had not quite heard those classical music, Western classical music, because during that time, Radio Nepal would play classical music, and every time it came on, everyone would like rush to turn off the radio. And, oh, turn it off, turn it off. We can't stand those Paschat Sangeet. So, that day, whole day I had to listen to this, classical music, tinkling of piano, and it almost drove me crazy. And I even talked to him, and he didn't play. He softened it. But later on, he used to play piano and all this thing. I began to like it, and it was like acquired taste, I guess. And I, now I really like it. But anyway, so but besides, I termed it as a cultural chef, a glimpse of Nepali modern, because David was a very serious architect. And even as a draftsman, I could, I worked closely with him, and I could sense his passion for architecture. And I couldn't understand so many things, and he was doing Bihari Lal's residence in Pulchok, which was very interesting. But, I would talk about his, this campus, Dhankuta campus, which he did together with another architect, Alex. And it came out pretty good, but it's in in a very, depleted condition right now. But anyway, so it was interesting for me to go back and see that Dhankuta campus, because during the time in the office, I thought David's design was, so serious, so exact, so strong, all the straight lines, very clear cut direction and all this thing. And the staff quarter, I was thinking it was too fragmented, little, all this thing, tiny bits and pieces. But at the end of the day, now it seems that staff quarter has gained lots of appreciation, and people really like it. And people, it seems, don't really care for that, hostel that David did, which is, very interesting study on Nepali vernacular and everything. So, I'll show this picture, okay. This is the hostel, the one on the right and on the top corner. So it's really interesting, it really comes from this terraced terrain and terraced house of the high hill of Nepal, and the use of a CGI seat and long overhanging roof, and it's very interesting in terms of ideas, and in execution also. Even inside there are quite interesting spaces. And the other thing is this library, when he was doing, when I was drawing it, I didn't realize, it came from Luai Khan's, secretariat, but now later on I could see, oh, it's getting the influence of that and this. And so, it was, that was very, I had chance to see some serious study being done by a serious architect. I think I was lucky in that. And the other interesting thing about that is he used the CGI sit in this Dhankota campus during that time. And even at one point, I remember even commenting to David, like, hey, this will like this, there is this, there will this condensation, all this dew will drop into this thing, without anything underneath. And he went like, he was like, oh, come on, it's there for its texture and surface or something like that. But, he shrugged it off. I remember that. But it's a well crafted and well detailed and everything. And the like the culture, like took it. And in Dhankuta, you see, like, even in the neighborhood, you see all these things. CGI sit on the balcony, and later on, like in a much later nowadays, like you see people using CGI sit as like in wall enclosure, and which is not practical and which is horrible. People just use it anyway. But here it was used for his, aesthetics, and bring in this idea of use of CGI sit in this, uh, uh, in his architecture. So it was very calculated use of this corrugated seat, and it still makes sense. But the way CGI seat are used these days, or like anything, But anyway, so this was Dhankoda campus, which was uh, I feel lucky to have worked for this and to have drawn much of so many drawings for David. Anyway, so this walking with vernacular, I would say, like, the other memorable instance would be like, uh, going to my mother's Pahargar, So it's in Charodi Dhading, and the actual old house is, was much depleted and no one was living there. And I stayed at my uncle's house, and it was, experience of a very, very typical Nepali hill living and architecture, which was, I've just sketched it, So it was, east-facing entrance, and there's pretty, and there was storage on this side, and the furniture on the other, the raised, platform. It was all outdoor living. Nothing would happen inside. I mean, the living would not happen inside. It would happen outside. And on the southern side, there was Diki and Janto, and this was, there was this wraparound lean-to roof on the main, structure. And it was ground floor, first floor, and the attic, And I would sleep on like this balcony on the first floor, You would not sleep inside, Inside was all storage and dark and everything. So you would mostly sit outside. So that was a very, very typical Nepali hill house that I got to experience. And, uh, uh, I would say it was memorable. It has stuck with me. And after that, later on, the other interesting instance would be like, trip to Panoti. I was working with this architect, Marina, French architect, who also designed this Rashtra Bank at near Singadarbar, Rashtrapanchi Bank. So she had this book on Panoti. It was a very well done book, but it was in French, so I couldn't understand. But it has really nice picture of Panoti, and that made us go to Panoti. I went to Panoti with my friend. Those days, the river was clean, like you can see how long, so it was really interesting to see that town, laid out, starting from this, meeting point of the two river, and starting and expanding from that point on. In a way, Kathmandu also does the same. I think it starts from the, emerging point of Bishnupati and Bagmati, and it just rises up all the way to the top, Kathmandu, and goes all the way, towards Surakuti. Anyway, so the layout of Panoti was very interesting, and the main center, like where, like next to the river, that is also, it was very interesting. So there was a nice trip, and also I feel good that I got to see Panoti when it was when the river was clean. So so After that, I was working in Rachana before going to US, and that time I designed one building totally on my own. I was draftsman, but still I designed this that should present this studio office. It was designed for fuel corporation during those days. Later on, it turned out to be like studio office, and my friend was at one point studio at that office, and I asked him, hey, uh, why don't you like refurbish, decorate and like make interior, like facelift this interior and put some handrail, and put like marble on the stair and everything, but it didn't happen. But I wish somebody would do it. I think it would look nice inside. But I did that thing to best of my knowledge, carefully, and I think you know I mean, if you when you do things honestly, you realize that you are that. You keep on doing it again and again, and that because that's who you are. Like you cannot be somebody else tomorrow, right? So that way is interesting to look back. So after that, the other interesting station would be Ranju's house at Bhaktapur near Dattatray. Ranju, a friend of my wife, Sony, uh, we went to her house once, inside the like core Bhaktapur area, and it was really fascinating. It was like small, I've sketched it. It's a small, like 12 feet around, 12 foot square courtyard, and you would enter, and in the center was this oil, well, water. Well, on the left was the stairway leading to the first floor, and there's little bit extended landing, and the thing was open to the courtyard. So what I was impressed with was, I'm always very impressed with, how they use the stair, they make stairs so efficient, and sturdy. So everything is calculated, everything is brought down to its size, so that, it's practical. If you make too big a stair, your stringer beam will be too big, like, and so in so many ways that, traditional staircases are so efficient and so beautiful, and it's also very, very practical. And the way they the attitude towards the residents, it was like not everything has to be concealed and inside the doors and windows. So this thing, like, it's outside and inside. It was like, even when things are small, then you get this sense of big. If not everything's are so contained these days. Houses are this collection of rooms, and every rooms are like carefully installed doors and windows, and that's not enough. They do this grill and everything. They make 7 feet a tall boundary wall and whatnot. Like this sense of security or sense of insecurity is so overwhelming. But anyway, that house, I thought was, so exact, and so efficient. So anyway, uh, I cannot, like, make it clear for you, but I can just get excited about it anyway. So we'll move to the next thing. And on this, we had a trip with my student to Kagbeni. I couldn't get the picture right now, so I couldn't show you. But the Kagbeni is very interesting town, because uh, on the eastern axis, between the merging point of this two river is the royal palace, which is in direct alignment with Muktinath. It's like in one alignment. And so the way, like, city has grown around this thing is interesting, so many interesting. But there is this interesting way of doing things. They have like bunch of twigs lined up in the roof terrace, working as a parapet. and they have to use wood, and there are lots of trees, and then in the winter it dries up, and they pick it up and bunch it up on the terrace and let it dry, and so that they can burn it when it's needed. But I asked this lady, like, why do you have this like a twig bunch as on the roof? And she looked at it and shrugged. Oh, it looks good, you know. So I thought that was an honest answer. It did look good. So what I'm trying to get is like there are something which is very practical, looks good, and really really functional. Not everything, but something. Okay, and we should be able to capture on those things. Like we cannot make everything look work equally well. But anyway, there are few things. Very unique characteristics of this. Kalbeni residents. So so that was interesting. And uh, so I would end this long walk with vernacular and go to this vernacular and sustainability. This long and ongoing walk with traditional Nepali building tradition, will it amount to anything significant? If that is the all, okay, so you have been to all this thing, you saw all this thing. So what does it mean? So I would like to bring in lifestyle of Jaipur of Kathmandu Valley. Jaipur these days are, I think, is a derogatory term or something like that. Maybe it's not politically correct to say Jaipur, but I think Jaipurs are Jaipurs, and their lifestyles are so commendable. Like if you look at their life, how they lived, it was agriculture and jatra. They didn't have to go and buy all these things to satisfy their ego or whatever. Anyway, it was self-sustained with zero product and packaging. Human scale and minimum use of machine. In this regard, I would like to say, when I was little, we would always question, okay, but why don't they use plow and use ox to plow the field and everything? And they would say, oh, you cannot do that. Wherever these eyes of the Swayambhu, is visible, but that was not very convincing. But we thought, okay, but anyway, they didn't use it because they could work with their hand. Why use the machine when you can work with the hand? Why make your life extra easy so that you would rest and get fat? So it didn't make sense to bring in all those machine and make in the name of efficiency. Like these days we do. We are ever so efficient and we clutter our life with the objects and machines and anyway. So some needs were fulfilled, and it's interesting. The other interesting thing that I realized, I have not made all this serious study, but I think people on the field on the low valley needed milk, but they were not like animal husbandry. The cow, cow was being raised on this little flat land, higher flat land of Kathmandu, from Koteswar to all the way to Gokarnathali and all this thing, and Baun Chetri kind of lived there, and I think the need for milk were being fulfilled by them, and the community lived, I think, happily exchanging goods and services, and not like oh, these people are taking all our money selling this, buying, we are buying this milk. Let's raise our own cow. It didn't go towards that direction. So they lived in harmony, I guess. Anyway, about the sustainability. Sustainability is not like doing everything, growing everything, and solving all the problem. Anyway, Nepali vernacular and its impact on architectural education. So, it's now I want to bring in this idea how the vernacular has affected, education. Uh, you know, I believe attraction is not because it fits our present purpose, but because it is labeled good, this so-called Nepali vernacular. But it does serve expat and visitors well. Culture can be lived or feasted upon. I mean, you can just eat your culture or you can live your culture, So, these days it seems like people are so greedy, they almost want to eat their culture, and get fat on it. Anyway, what's happening with this thing, this attraction towards this Nepali or vernacular architecture is it's incapacitating it, it's hindering students' capacity to explore, experiment, innovate, because uh, this is what is a prevalent. Being sympathetic tourist and living the tradition is not the same thing. So we have to realize, are we like appreciating Nepali culture as a tourist, or like we like it because we live it, So, if you are, being a tourist and tantalizing by it, and like, you are fascinated by it, you have to be careful. Tradition in modern times have become a packaged product. Traditional building should be a matter of specialization, not made to push aside the core requirement of architecture education. Because I say this because these students are really moving towards this traditional theme, and they end up like, at like putting a couple of courtyard and jingati roof and wooden post, and that's the extent of design. If you do any other thing, it will not look like tradition. So big, and they are like scared to like explore and innovate or add some things, because it will stop looking like, traditional Nepali building. So, it's not conducive. Appreciation of tradition is not easily transformed into knowledge and then applied to address the present day needs. So we have to understand that this is not easy to, to study tradition and make it applicable, serve us, most of the time it can't, it just wants to become a museum piece. But anyway, present trend of leaning heavy on vernacular, but at the same time ambivalent towards reading and contemplating on books, like simple books like, house form and culture, pattern language, and structure of ordinary, could, hinder student to explore, experiment, and innovate. Leaning too heavily on the tradition, form, and not doing real architecture, not developing design skill. Design skills should not be compensated by evangelical zeal to resurrect the tradition. It should rather be focused on MArch and PhD. If you really want to study traditional Nepali architecture, do master, do PhD on it. And the other thing is sustainability. I've written it on sustainability. When we look at Jaipur of Kathmandu Valley, its culture is not a product display on the windows of NGOs. I'm being critical, but that's how I feel. It is also not a paint job that you apply over a pathetic modern life of wastefulness in the name of efficiency. You become wastefulness. 23 hours and 1 hour decide to become this sustainable. Doesn't work that way. I guess in architecture it is largely an engineering solution, which when you develop certain level of design skill can be incorporated and assimilated in your design. So you can wait and first get your skill up, get your design skill up, and then you can incorporate all this tradition and whatnot, if you choose to. So sustainability, in our traditional term, it is lok sangraha. Lok sangraha because Ishwar prevails in everything. How does Ishwar prevails in everything? Because in the act of creation, it lived as a desire to become. So anyway, sustainability, I believe, is a spiritual journey that encompasses all mode of living and working, and not only architecture. We are connected to industry that uses large amount of natural resources, and if there is room for attitude adjustment, will definitely save a lot. But that doesn't amount to now you know how to design. So that's being little critical, uh, but we have to be on guard, about these things, what we like, and not be blinded, because let's not forget, studying architecture is developing design skill, and it's not like, appreciation of traditional architecture class, where you learn how to appreciate all these little nuances. It's you are architect, you have to learn how to design, so you better focus on it on your BR chair, otherwise you'll just miss it, we have to be clear of purpose and, maintain our focus. And the same goes for student, don't get swayed, like don't get swayed by any other style too, before like you learn like design, certain design skill. So what is that design skill? So design skill, you could say, I am like, I've organized it. It's design what, why, and how. Action carried out by a person or some sort of a force. There is man-made design and there is nature created design, which is beautiful. Sometimes it's scary, anyway. And the designer is, architect, that's us, okay? So we are talking about architects, so let's come to architect. And so this thing is, we have to look at this relation between man and the object. And there is this third dimension, which is like mystery of creation. We don't know like how it happened, where it's going, like what's going to happen next, why it's here. And we have to make sense of all these things. This mystery of creation is really, misdemeanor, it jumbles up everything, So, a traditional term in a universe is conceived as Jeev Jagat Ishwar. Jeev is the self, And this mystery of creation, what it does is this opens up all the possibilities of good and bad equally. And we get this feeling we're never complete, we're always incomplete, because, anything can happen. You can wish for anything, you might just get fulfilled, who knows. So because of this incompleteness, we are always like desiring for fulfillment through all these natural resources by use of organ of action like hands and feet. So employ those tools, hands and feet, and the material in the natural resources, and we try to fulfill our wishes through that by creating wish fulfilling, whatever that is. And while doing that, we're pretty smart. We think of like, oh, how can I make it even easier? How can I not work so hard? How can I produce even more? How can I have my desire fulfilled even more, like 10 times more? So we bring this idea of this profit and loss, so getting smart or being dumb. So this creation of object is something useful and something nice, and we become like pretty engaged in it and start worrying about profit and loss while creating it, while having it, So this relationship with this, us and the natural resources, and this force of nature, where constantly these things are constantly at play, and our desire is constantly being, we are fulfilling our desire. Anyway. So, so when we produce, that when we do our like building, let's say when you design, when you produce, how does that become a work of art? So human labor and creation of object of desire. So if you focus on that, there's this thing called, it involves a design and evolution. Things are designed or it evolves into something else. There is this transformation of object, so which is like, it was not there before, but it has come to fulfill our wish, fulfill our desire by being nice and useful. So we always are like wanting for something nice and something useful. So and naturally we create attachment towards this object. Attachment because we also label over this ownership and authorship, like you want it, who created it, because it is nice and usually you want to know who did it, and because you want to reward or you want to punish the guy, or you want to take pride or be ashamed of, social and all this legal norm is into, play. So this object, object of desire, that object we create, we render value to it, so value, we have to, look at this value system, human labor, something nice, something useful, and some use value and surplus value, fetish, an object of art. I would like to say a little thing about this thing, uh, uh, about this of uh, fetishizing, like for example, you know, uh, Ram Bahadur went to a forest and he cut the wood, tree, and like, saw the wood and like, build a chair for himself. And so, he was sitting in this chair and his friend, Syam Prasad happened to barge in and he saw this guy sitting in a chair and like, wow, what is that you are doing? I'm sitting in a chair. Well, this is really exciting. Hey, give it to me. And he said, no, but, he really coerced him into giving him like, what? I'll give only if you like give me like 500 rupees for it. Hey, no problem, take 500 rupees. And he takes the chair and sits on it and so happy. All the people in the village are excited about the chair. They come and look at him and there is big merchant, he has heard about it and he wants that chair, so he comes to the Ram Bahadur and like Syam Prasad, and Syam Prasad doesn't want to sell this thing, and he says, you know what, you have to sell me. Tell me what is your price, I'll give you a price, everything has a price, just let me know what's the price. So ultimately, Ram Bahadur sells it for 5,000. He bought it 500. Now he sells it for 5,000. So this merchant takes the chair into his house and he puts there and he sits on it and he's afraid to sit on it because he might ruin it, right? So he puts that chair in the center of his courtyard for everybody to see, So now that chair has become more valuable than 5,000 because he's not going to sell it. There is no one richer than him, and it's not being sit upon. It's being only looked upon. With desire, and everybody wants to have. So things becomes like that, and it becomes cultural object. So in our case also, we can see. The building being transformed into cultural object because it's a work of art and architect, and it becomes architectural or cultural heritage. So uh, there is this thing, okay, that's what we are working for in a way, how ethically right or wrong it is, it's a debatable, but we are working for that so that we can create cultural object, we can shape culture, we can give direction to the culture, our creation is appreciated by this whole culture, so life well lived kind of thing, and now the thing is like, this skill, this production of work of art, this becoming cultural heritage, can it be learned? Can it be taught? And the answer is yes, because skill can be acquired, learned. Thus, it also can be taught. That's where the education comes in. We all want to be skillful on that. So there comes the education, and I would like to talk about education a little. So this academic, this my such unsolicited advice, but I'll say it anyway. This academic institution should invest on building strong faculty and capable teachers. It seems like institutes are like under this tyranny of the profit, and they want to they don't want to like design their faculty and choose and select, so okay, somebody said that we should hire him, so we hire him, like somebody else said anyway, the head of department has very little say on what, the kind of faculty that he wants to create. So it's very important that the faculty is created under the guidance and leadership, so that everybody at the same pace. Qualified teachers are rare, so invest on retaining, uh, retraining. Sorry, and we have to, if the teacher are not qualified enough, you think we have to train them, right? And also, like, we should invest in further education of faculty member, because you cannot get it from outside. You grow your own, right? So you send your teacher for like PhD, not in some kind of weird, subject, but in architecture. If they want to teach architecture, they have to do master and PhD in architecture that is related to like design studio. Anyway, so and also education space and facility, adequate and appropriate space available for review and exhibition of the student work. And these things are not only a problem of a nation like ours. Even in our outside world, there are so many old campus, and they have the review space are scarce, and students are always like running for space to stick their work. Anyways, so for a class of 24, I think we need to provide one lead teacher and 3 assistant teacher. Then only we can conduct meaningful desk grade. Otherwise, the process will be rushed. I don't have time. I'm too tired. My mind is fried. I cannot talk to any more people. I usually get fried after talking to 5 person. Then I realize I have nothing more new to say. I have to wait one day to recuperate and like again be myself and give a meaningful description. Anyway, so this allow general review to go for at least 45 minutes and longer for final review. Allow final thesis review to continue for 3 hours. Don't rush student in their final review. They have worked 5 years for this day, and they are being rushed into 15 minutes and all these things, because the authority doesn't have enough time. Not fair to the student, and not fair to the whole education system, where you don't talk like about your work. If the work is really insignificant and there's nothing to say, then they should feel it like their work is so you know so bad. Anyway, so we should slowly try to adopt these train and design studio teacher. They should be successful practitioner, well-read and articulate, somebody who would be genuinely interested in the work of the student. I say this because it's very hard to get interested in students' work. You see their work and they don't know what they're doing. My God, they are being so stupid. Like, how could they do it? How could they not even think about that? And you get totally like frustrated and you want to go home. It can't be do like that. Students are like that. You should be genuinely interested in their all weakness and like haphazardness. You should be able to see and make some sense of it, and like try to take that and push it a little further, encourage student to push a little further. And so that way we can actually aid this student. And there is also like this student side where they have to do their they have to be prepared like proper adhikari. Anyway, so this thing is, get over the myth of genius. They said, oh, Frank Lloyd Wright did his falling water in a matter of hours, when the client was on his way. And so, what, I'm also Frank Lloyd Wright, I'll wait for the last moment. That doesn't work. That maybe that didn't happen or something like that. Every architect worked really hard. They read, they worked, day and night. So hardworking, you have to be hardworking. Without hard work, there is no architecture. Anyway, develop drafting and visualization skill. So in this thing, when we're studying architecture, like in certificate level architecture, there was this subject which was like tracing and visualization, going from this Nepali school from the 10th grade, and visualization was a very strange word, and we would often talk about, hey, what is this visualization? What, nobody knew what the visualization was, but there was this subject tracing. We understood tracing, you trace, okay, you are being trained for draftsman, but what is this visualization? So there is this core skill with drafting, and visualization. So we have to draw, sketch, learn to see, try to develop coordination between hand and mind and things like that. So try to see the line, try to see the shadow and all these things, how the color changes. Anyway, okay. So draw, develop skill in the get used to the tools of the trade, how to hold the pencil, how to use, how to do this watercolor and all these things, including how to, do the computer, but computer is like, it's little remove, little distance. There is a stage that you can quite understand, mystery between you and your work. And, so it is little disconcerting, but anyway, use computer also, Then other thing is like read, including architectural picture book. Look at the buildings and all these things, read and contemplate. Make scale model to test, explore, and communicate your design. Okay, it's very, very essential. When you make model, make the base of the model sturdy, take it seriously, and use plain and not colorful, plain and stiff material with some thickness. It really matters. Don't make a flimsy model, make a model, Anyway, beware of this space. So another thing is to train yourself when you are moving around, not in the college, not at the school. Be aware of this space, surface, element of architecture and the form around you. And every time things that draws your attention, just measure it, walk with the tape measure and measure everything, find out what's the measurement, and how heavy or like, all these things, touch it, how does it feel? So you have to do that, get familiar with gestalt, this theory of the, like what completes the incompleteness, the like shadow and like ground and like, thing, and like, composition in 2D. So you have to get good at it. Your visualization should be, much more developed, and ultimately you improve on expression. You have to be articulate and you have to write tangible, something interesting, like, because what you think is what you write. If you cannot write, if your language is not good, your thinking is not good, you will not be able to design. Your bhasa, your language, if it's not good, you cannot design, because you cannot think if your language is not good. So it's a big hindrance, this language. If you cannot master it, you have to master it, because language is, there is this grammar involved in it and creation of meaning, putting words in a certain way, pronouncing in a certain way, sometimes making same word into a joke or abuse or slander or something. So the language is like, there is so many interesting aspects of the language, so you should get good at it. For that, you have to read and write, okay? Now this is important, take occasional break to clean up. What happens is, when we're doing this architecture, as a student or as a professional, the mess starts piling up, and it's a good thing, because you can take a break, shift your mind and clean your space, and you'll realize your mind also becomes totally clean. Suddenly you are energized once again. So do that. And fix and maintain a broken object at home. Try to fix things. It is another training that is available every now and then. Take opportunity to fix things. If something is broken, go and try to fix it. Yeah. Because it trains you on how things work. This how things work is a very interesting phenomenon. If you really look at it, how things work. If you repeat it 5 times, you'll start getting the meaning behind it, like how things work. Things work on itself, or you make it work. Anyway, maintain the mindset that you are a student. All thing education comes first. So you have to be sure you are a student. In our traditional wisdom, we say, "Vyavasayitmika buddhi," what you have to be clear who you are, what you do, what's your purpose. If you are a student, you are a student. Maintain your student self. Later on you can become a householder and do all the things like fun things and everything. But as a student, the learning is education is first. Prioritize that. You know, and develop ability to comprehend. So this is the critical thing. Being able to comprehend. Comprehension. This is really, big thing in my opinion, and the biggest hinder in education of architect in Nepal, especially in Nepal, because early education in our school, there is a pressure to score and find out right answer, not in your, not your own answer, but right answer, and when it's not your own answer, the right answer is what right answer is, then you can't go wrong. Then you can score the highest, right? So don't try to be smart. Yeah, don't try to be smart. Find out the right answer from your teacher and make it by heart. So it is also convenient for teacher because you won't have to like evaluate students' finding. So it's always clear. The right answer gave him like full mark kind of thing. So teacher jobs equally becomes easy, and he's also comfortable. He doesn't want to change the status quo. So and also like students and teacher are equally happy because the grade cannot be disputed, because everybody knows what's the right answer. There's no confusion, you know. So what happens is then there's this realization in design studio. You come to design studio, then you find out that you can't look for right answer within yourself. You are unable to look for right answer within yourself. You are looking for right answer from your friend and teacher, and nobody has the right answer because nobody knows the right, like only correct way of designing. You have to walk the path. You have to find the, like the resources within yourself. You have to understand, make sense of things, and you should be able to take a risk to express yourself. you know so finding right answer is risking yourself, you know because you have to express yourself. The right answer from yourself, coming from yourself, you are not sure, but you have to risk it. What if mistakenly so why are we afraid? Because what if mistakenly someone finds out mistakenly, somebody wrongly finds out that you are not as smart. You could be smart or you could be dumb, but what if they find out that you are not as smart? This inability to comprehend and make information, research, and findings useful, coupled with fear of being wrongly judged, puts lots of student at a fix. So student becomes like, rabbit in a headlight kind of thing. They cannot move. They don't know what to do next because uh, they don't know how to comprehend this information. They do research and they all these findings, but they don't know how to turn that into a diagram. And they don't want to risk it and be judged. So student just cannot start or begin to design. In architecture, the thoughts and talk will have to be expressed graphically in diagrams. So diagramming is the big thing on architecture. Your learning has to be expressed in diagram, like in physics. What you are saying has to be expressed in mathematics. So same in architecture, and it has to be, it is no less complicated. Just because you see everyone's designing doesn't mean designing is that easy. Anyway, it is only possible you're able to comprehend the research and finding. So diagramming is possible only if you are able to make sense of things, see pattern in things, then you can go and draw and make sense and put things in a certain organization. So be careful. Architecture is a very harsh path and there is no room for sentimentality. no sentiment. Usually have no place in architecture. You cannot, oh, I feel this, you can be poet, but not architect, architects are poet too, but there's another dimension of poetry, where, you investigate the meaning of the word and how can it be used. Anyway, so emotionally, emotional flight, that's not going to take you anywhere, because design is a deliberate, intended, and studied response. So you have to be deliberate, intended, and studied. So that's design. That's a real design. We're not talking about fluke design, but real design. We're not talking about somebody went shopping for foam and they pasted that thing. He was skillful paster and he did it good. That is also good skill, but still you have to be deliberate, intentional, and the work has to come through study. It should show the path of improvement, like this is how my design is improving, from preliminary to like final design kind of thing, the thought process, how it's being concretized or how it's being articulated. The same, the design is slowly, it gets articulated. Anyway, so through this deliberate and comprehensive understanding of a project emerges as a design concept. So then only you have a design concept after having clear idea about this, your task, after deliberating through, after solving it in like in its, basic form. It's not like, there is this general misconception about this concept, which is like first you go shopping for concept. There are lots of concept in the book, in the other building, in the nature. So you just pick one and like start designing. And that's not how it's done. First, you have to know what you were going to design, and you have to generate concept. And sometimes these analogies are there.
Excuse me, screen share.
I know. It just, I'm not sharing the screen deliberately. I want people to see me. Concept, this. So I was talking about this pre-existing concept is not a pre-existing and free-floating goods to be picked up at the curbside or before you even begin to design. Remember, architecture is deliberate. That is not design that people will, we don't disagree that people win a lottery or get struck by the lightning, things like that happen, but architecture is very deliberate, and it's not like, you casually pick something up as a concept and start designing. So research, analyze, and build understanding and build knowledge, that will allow you to conceptualize and generate a working diagram, Then you can adopt a design technique that will enable you to communicate your design, provide direction and guidance through this concept, will guide you throughout the design development process, all the way to the final design. It will help you communicate, it will help you generate, it will create some rules and certain parameter that you to move around, certain margins and all this thing, So every architect develops and works with his own unique design technique. There is a lot of common feature among every other architect. So we're different in our way and style of working, but at the same time, we're also very same, So there is much to be learned. And also there is, individuality that has to be cultivated. So you get my point, you have to assimilate all this contradiction, So I hope you are following me, and this internet is, the connection is still okay, so that you hear me talking instead of a ringing sound or bell or something like that. But anyway, so after this, we'll come to this more of a professional practice. I call it flight of a butterfly, professional practice at JP. That is, the firm that I'm affiliated with. Uh, in early 2018, we did a proposal for a showroom and corporate headquarter. Of course, that didn't came through, you know, uh, but uh, that you know, though it didn't came through, that was our starting point in a way. And like, starting point in a say, like direction is like, if somebody tells you like you have to go there, what you do is like, what you don't do is like you turn this way and we say, oh, there. You don't say that, you orient yourself towards the direction that is pointing. And because you have to walk there, so you have to be direct. So that in that sense that it gave us a kind of a direction, and we're walking that path, so we're building this body of work, walking that path, and like rounding the corners, because the path is a little familiar, like we have been walking this path, like surprises are like not really scary, there is the possibilities are opening. So uh, deliberate and directed and building upon your previous work. So that's how we're doing. So I'll share this work, you know uh, this our this corporate headquarter, which we call like flight of a butterfly. And it was the two wings kind of thing. In this thing, it was not only about form, but the function were articulated, and it was put together, uh, and it had a certain form, because we wanted to create a variety in office building, and office building that is not really contained the floors. Not only it was the assimilation of different block and like inside outside, that thing, because we are not in Europe, like Kathmandu is the best place to practice architecture, because the weather is so great. You can really do architecture here. In like if you're in Europe, the thing is so cold. You cannot imagine having outlet. But people design in this all kind of different country, and their architect, they have this outdoor life. If you're in Boston, 9 months you are inside a room. Terrible. Anyway, but Kathmandu is such a nice place to practice architecture. I think you can. There is so latitude is so great. Like you can do so much. Anyway, so it was this was our butterfly. And we were traditionally being very modern. You're trying to be very modern. Anyway, so this is kind of the direction that we took, and it was interesting office building. So, and the other thing, this flight of the butterfly, how did it continue? We did a project in Manam, and there were all kind of thing. One of that was a Gangapurna Lake Park, where, in the edge of the Gangapurna, we're building this dam and like, doing a homestay kind of thing, and developing a public park and viewing deck and little tiny, souvenir store. And a spa and, restaurant and dining hall. So it was very interesting project. And the Manang and Gangapurna Lake is just fascinating. And, you'll experience this in this mountain like no other place, amazing. And if you climb up to this Karpen Gumpa and see the mountain range from there, it's just breathtaking. You should do it once. But anyway, there are so many other places equally interesting in Nepal. But this was another viewing deck. So we've been working in this shape and form for the viewing deck. So you would view it was the view of the lake. More than like it's there for viewing the lake, but it is there to, let's say, glorify us, because we wanted to have this, hey, who did this thing? It looks like, so like not ordinary kind of thing. Anyway, so that was a viewing deck, and the sense of winged butterfly and all this thing, that direction, that triangle, pointedness, we try to stay somehow consistent with that. And in the Manang Day, we also did this government assembly, and so it was, this was the gate, and like, it was also being consistent and being like forceful form, and also very practical, and like, uh, yeah, how can we assimilate a triangle and all this thing and make it look like kind of organic, and like, we the okay, concept for this thing was Thar, like Himalayan Thar. So, so this the our forms are kind of animal like in a way. So anyways, so this was the assembly. We're also like, here experimenting with assembly as this round form, circular form within the triangle. So anyway, so the other thing, same assembly. Another thing was this visitors information center at Dhukur Pokhari. We were like trying to revitalize the dried up Lake Dhukur Pokhari. Very interesting site, undulated hills and this small lake. I think if they ever did it something like that, it would be such an interesting place. We did this little bit park and meditation center and things like that. From there you could see this, like, they call it Swargadwari, this big rocky edifice, towards east, which is amazing view. But anyway, so this was a visitors information center, and then we did this uh, in Butol, Gajeri. It's called Gajeri, but it's called Danapur now. Its original name was Gajeri. Gajeri has a very strange connotation, I think. Excuse me. Uh, so this is the homestay. This was the lake park kind of thing. And this is tiny thing is this tiny butterflies. This was this homestay in a bunch of things, in an island like space. And we also did the view tower. We did this lightning struck Lake Gajari kind of thing. So so we're this experimenting. There's a horn like thing, like little bit animalistic, little bit of like thundering, with a strong bass cylinder, and have something, have an interesting viewing experience because of the view tower. But anyway, so the other interesting project that we are doing right now is a small Thakali Dalbat kind of place at Bhoteodar, on the way to Manang. And so this is basically a dining hall up front, kind of a temporary, because it is being built, on the right, within the right of way, and maybe it will get, pulled down in 5 or 10 years, who knows. And we are making it like a temporary kind of structure in steel and wood, and not concrete slab roof and all those things. We're using concrete, like kind of a window frame only. And we're using wooden, like this, roof structure, which is flying along this path of the butterfly, I guess. It's a small, we want to do this small but very eye-catching project, and I hope I hope it gets built, which will be interesting, to see, like, some very tectonic, piece in whatever dark. Anyways, so, and I just decided to show this thing, we're doing this competition, and like, we're not sure whether we want to do it or not, but maybe we'll do it. uh, but uh, this is a big office building, and we are experimenting with this form, so for this office building, we wanted something really iconic, very sparse, clean, and iconic. It would be recognizable, and it would like have this bold presence with very little confusing, move on the facade and all this thing. So I don't know. Maybe we'll, file for competition and not win, or win. I don't know. But this is interesting. This glass tower box is rising from this, on this triangular thing, you know. So I think it will be interesting if they build something like this. It will be like a 15-story, But anyway, so this was the other thing that we were recently doing, and the form was kind of exciting. I just wanted to share it with you all. So professional practice, JAB, what we do, building partnership, nurturing talent. So in JAB, there is Raju Rai, and there is Yem Rahadi Magar, and there is me, and there is intern Ujjwal. So what we do is like, our relationship is of partnership. It's not like, uh, being boss and constantly being worried about, how am I going to pay them? Maybe they will take all the information and, leave me high and dry kind of thing. There is no such things, we're such a strong team, full of trust and everything. It's so nice and comfortable to work with all these people. So everybody says that, good vibe in the office is such a nice place. We wanted to have that, and I've experienced, from culture in Nepal, which is like not conducive to architecture, Uh, I mean, usually the people are so tense that you might, supersede, or you might, do something without informing your boss or something like that. You might use this information in a negative way, because in Nepal, lot of us engage in this underhand dealing, and you want to keep all this hush hush thing going on. So it has made a thief of us all. But anyway, so, and the other thing that we want to do is we want to pick up talented people and foster them and encourage them, maybe like, help them to learn things and do things. If we cannot give them money, we can do so many other things, so we try to do those things. So comfortable office work environment where 5 days a week, 9 to 5, but with this pandemic, it's little, disrupted, and we would eat lunch in the office because the office would start from 8, we would start 8 to 5 and 1 hour lunch break. So it was, and we would cook food in the office is in the ground floor of my house, Batisputali. So, and we would eat home cooked food, and it was really nice, but it has changed a little with the pandemic. But that's how we, do our office, uh, improve the improve upon the previous work, keep the body of work relevant. So that's what the flight of butterfly I wanted to show you, because we want to be consistent. Like, it is not like McDonald everywhere having this golden arch sign. It is not like that. uh, it is developing the body of work that is consistent and honest, and is actually coming from you. You are not being adventurous on this form shopping and like, hey, today I feel like continental. Oh, yesterday I ate Chinese and I'm done with Chinese for 5 weeks now. It's not like that. Architecture doesn't work that way. You pick up a path and you go for it. Anyway, architecture is deliberate, intentional, and studied. That's how we want to see it, and that's how we see it. That's how we want to do it. Okay, and so now I come to this Institute of Architecture because architecture is an institution. Architects from all over the world are contributing to its edifice with commitment to profession and clarity of purpose. That's what we're all doing. We're all responsible for education of architects. So that's one of the prime, responsibility of us all practicing architect, that we are responsible for education of architect, because that's the only way how we can elevate this position of architect within a culture. We demand excellence, so we should be somebody who demand excellence. Without it, we fall. As an institution, we fall. It will translate in a monetary form, because client don't want to pay some insignificant person. Anyway, so let's not be provincial and limited. Let's not keep ourselves, I come from Wolong Chungola and I'm going to do only Wolong Chungola. There is some wisdom to that. If you look at Glen Market, okay, fine. But, as an architect, as an artist, as a designer, we are free to envision and create, to the extent that we can bring, how free are we, to the extent that we can bring client and his stakeholder to our side. If they agree, if you have a certain personality, they will agree. If you have certain body of work, they will agree. But in our mind, if they agree or not, but in our mind, we're always free. At least in our mind, we should be free. Okay. In fact, people, men are free only in their mind. Rest. No. Anyway, sorry. So we nourish the institute and in turn get our desire fulfilled by this institute, right? That means command good consulting fee, which is not happening right now. People are so hesitant paying 4 lakh for a residence design. They say, what 4 lakh, man? Why? What do you do? I did all the designings, and you say you did designers. All this argument. And so let's work and prepare for next stream project. That's the attitude we should have. I'm preaching, but I'm also preaching for young architect, I guess. Goal can extend beyond the lifetime and could journey through generations. So let's not be limited to this life only, because architecture is an institution and we are working for institute. So we can limit ourselves to this my life. It will go on. So it's a long haul thing. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. Let's be prepared for long haul. Let's take pride in the job well done. Ultimately, no matter what kind of job you do, let's take pride in the job well done. And for SONA, I think there's one big hope that we have all placed on SONA, competition. It is only through competition, I cannot begin to force myself to this thing. This is only through free competition the whole architecture will rise. So SONA should do everything possible to foster this idea of competition and organize and train and suggest. This would really get into it, this culture of competition. And the other thing is there is not only one type of competition. Okay, there is you invite 5 people, and do the competition on these 5 selected people. Sometimes you do this open competition, sometimes limited to this, limited to that. But let's do this competition. And there is this attitude, I see creeping in, old established architects are not willing to compete in this free open competition, because all these young kids are coming up, and what if I lost the competition and they won the competition? It will be so embarrassing. All these kids are for me, and these kids will go gaga. Hey, look, all those are, all these they are so irrelevant. Let's push them away. But this could be tricky. So so I encourage everybody to be have some patience and some reserve, and express themselves, intelligently, not be childish about it. Okay, we're all responsible for this competition, and we should all build this conducive environment for this competition to take place. Without this, there is no architecture. We have to do this competition. Only competition can change, architectural scene in our country. You know, I believe. So that's where SONA is most relevant, and only SONA can do it. So SONA should do it. So you know, so this is a big and very interesting responsibility. So in the frag end, I want to talk about interiority just briefly. In architecture, is unique because of its interiority, because it can be accessed and the ability to occupy the space. This is a very strange phenomenon. We're not satisfied with shopping our t-shirt, like paying for a t-shirt and walking out. We want to be in the place where we feel good while shopping. We occupy and own the space for a time being, and we feel certain way. So architecture does that. It has got this interiority where is exterior makes sense. When you look at it, you are pulled by this idea. You want to go inside. There is possibility to go inside. It is not in sculpture, or it is not a wall. There is something inside. So in this very line, we did this one competition, which I hear that it went defunct or something like that, so it's not gonna work. So I thought I would just share it. So it is, I termed it in depth of the memory, the inside. It was a memorial, and I wanted to do the memorial, raise it and make a pavilion, but obelisks kind of thing, but with the entrance, and the entrance had to be highlighted because that way it would draw people towards it, because let's go inside kind of thing. And you could actually go inside, and there is interesting space inside the thing. But but we are working with if you remember this Thana Power Viewing Tower, and our theme, our main thrust, we maintain that thrust, and so it was near Buddha, and it was a good thing that it had this little bit sense of Buddha to it. And I'm always trying, I'm not being successful here, but I'm always trying to inject Kirat Lichavi era architecture, so and that has got, that is not being explored or appreciated, maybe in a popular sense, I guess. So I see lots of scope on that, So I try the entrance, I try to do that. Anyways, so this was, memorial with a, a gallery accessed on from the other side, and this side was a reflecting pool, and it was raised a little, and you could have a very clear view in the midst of the traffic and all these things. So it was, we thought, interesting form and very captivating. This would be the yellow would be metal, and inside would be glass, and it would really glow in the night, and it would be like birds in its flight. So it was, we thought it was interesting memorial. Anyway, so there is other thing, as an architect, we can never disjoint from ourselves from the housing sector. So the housing side of the profession is, what are we doing on that thing? Okay, there's a house for Balman, which are we doing, which we think is assimilation and reconciliation. So there is a lot of adjustment, a lot of compromises and everything. But this urban form, we are really working with a certain form and really improving on that form. How can, with the courtyard and living room and the kitchen in the back, in the middle dining hall, and on the back wall of the dining hall staircase, and dining hall facing the courtyard staircase. I mean, we would love to make it more open, but we have to put windows all over. So, but anyway, we are really working in this form, where this is our, let's say, research or whatever study in this tight existing site, which is, pretty general case of Kathmandu in these days, 4 ana of land, so we're really working on that thing. And this is like, we're trying to put lots of things together and make sense of it all, and create a little bit of like, excitement, and little bit of like a little bit of this and a little bit of that, without being gaudy, and not be like plain and simple. So this was the idea. We didn't want it to be like, stark, sparse. We wanted to be like a little bit ornate. So so what we did was, this is what we do. So what we do, we usually like, work with AutoCAD and SketchUp. I personally really make use of SketchUp because it really speeds the process of design, because you can really design in 3D. It makes visualization easier. And also, like, we study in model, so we build lots of model and make study in model. And we also do like study on 2D study in flat plane, because in the composition wise, how does it work in 2D and 3D? So we do also like black and white things, like without all this, rendering as a black and white thing. How does it look? Does the composition, sits well or not? Like relations of mass void, like is this all this thing working? And so this is how we generate test our work. So, and we have titled this memory of modern. It's trying to be little, a little looking behind a little, but still not sure how to do it. For example, this grill window, I wanted this grill window, but if you do this grill window, it will like, oh, did you pick it from did you steal it from some temple complex and put it here, kind of thing? No, I made it. I mean, if you had to make it new, why didn't you do something else, right? So there is this thing, but I wanted to bring this sense, of this window in here, like this Saja kind of thing. So I think this house will be interesting. I hope it to be interesting. And also another experiment we're doing is like, opening up the entrance, in the ground floor, it is apartment, 2-room apartment for rent, and first floor living room, dining, kitchen, and the, second floor there is study, back, and bedrooms and roof terrace and like whatnot, all these things, and a little bit of slope roof, because we want to put a solar panel on the southern face, this face south, we want to put solar panel. And we wanted to do a little bit of like sustainability thing, like, evaporation, cooling and things like that over here, but I don't know if we can do that or not. So this was the, trying to be modern, it is little, it's nice, it looks nice, but, it's still not well-rounded. There's a lot for us to do, work with this Nepali thing, work with the memory, work with modernity, maybe, we'll get better, but still, it's, even though the way it is, the people appreciate it, and we also like it. We have been working very hard on each dimension are carefully calculated and everything. So this is an interesting project, very deliberate. It brings everybody's head together, how are you going to make this thing work? Anyway, so moving next. This is ongoing study. This housing is ongoing study in JAP, and we make lots of study of that thing, that kind of housing, row housing, all kind of form, like in many form, like, many attitude, but remaining kind in a similar vein, like, some are a little cheaper, some are with less bedroom, some with the attic, but the similar vein, some with the soft front and little small courtyard, And, so, lots of variation in the theme, but we're working some with the Dalan, can we do with the Dalan and all. So this is housing is ongoing, very interesting project. We're constantly improvising and expect to get better and better at it. And let's see, and we, in the same way, we also are fascinated with the small place. Like, we make lots of study of tea shop, small tea shop. How can we do this small tea shop by the roadside? There is this shop and this small place for a guy to sleep there, and put food for preparation and a little bit showcase. And in the daytime they can extend the chairs, and there is small sitting inside also. But how can this working with small place, it's really fascinating, and it's a very learning experience, and it's really optimization on the space and users also. So we also try to work with that thing, and we've been working, and it's an interesting thing. But we dream to do this, rows of tea shop on some bus stand, or like along some hillside road. Like this tea shop we envision doing in Beretar, because when you see in Beretar on this side of the hill, there are a lot of small rows of tea shop, So we imagine, like, what if all this thing were well designed and very articulate, this would look so beautiful, so pretty in the same tea shop. Maybe one day streets of Kathmandu will look very pretty, and talking about small tea shop, no job is too small on this thing. It so happened that we had to design a gatehouse for Mamata, and she wanted to do a house. Oh, let's do it in 5 lakh and prefab and everything. And we said, no, like, wait a minute, like, let's do it little nicely, because it's in the front of your house, and the first thing people see is the gatehouse, and you don't want to, do it, happens earlier. So we did this planning, and the planning of this is also there's a garage, and there's in the ground floor a bedroom for a driver, and the floor above there are 2 rooms and then one small kitchen, and there is a staircase leading to the first floor. Underneath the staircase there is a small toilet and a little backyard kind of thing. There one privacy, and so we wanted to the steps are really crazy, and it's really high. We wanted to bring this idea of forcefulness. We're forcing things. The things were not adequate, so we had to just make it happen, like they do in squatter things, which has some kind of energy. So we were trying to bring that thing, which came out interestingly okay. And we also made client very happy with, oh, now she's happy to see this house in front of the layout is almost like this, it will be like this in this house. So that was one thing interesting. And long live architecture, uh, that's how I would want to end. Long live architecture, more power to architecture. Maybe we will be gone, architecture will be here. Let's add something to it. So on that positive and revolutionary note, I would like to end my talk. So Anushka,
Yes, sir.
sorry,
Anusha.
you're here.
Thank you so much,
So,
Chandra, sir. It's always a pleasure listening to you, and I'm sure our audience are very happy to be part of this productive presentation. And being an architecture student myself, I could really relate to the things you have said earlier. And I think we have some audience who are very eager to ask you a question about your presentation. So should we move forward to question and answer session, sir?
yes, I'm ready, and I hope I'll be able to answer this
Okay,
question.
We have one question from Lina Tiliza, sir. She's asking about how is professional practice similar and different from educational practice of architecture in Nepal?
There is one thing in this regard I want to mention. I might give roundabout answer, because, I think you cannot give direct answer, you can only respond to this query, I guess. Uh, there is this complaint in this professional world that, people come from architectural institute and they don't teach you how to do this architecture, and they can't even draw properly, you know, and I say, that's okay, in the architecture school is not crunching out money making robots, so that they would go and come to your firm and start making money for you. It's not like that, What happens is they come with certain attitude and they will train you in your job for some time and they will gain expertise. For example, when I was studying, the AutoCAD was a big thing, it had just came, and I didn't register for that class because you have to pay money for that AutoCAD class, and I would rather do so many other interesting thing, like a poetry appreciation class, instead of that AutoCAD, because AutoCAD I can always learn in a matter of week, and so the way it happens was when I was in New York and working, and they're using AutoCAD release 14, and in 14 days, I was as good as anybody, So, in academic institution, uh, you get general education. And you go to this professional world and learn, improve, and gain expertise. So that's how it works. Nobody should complain that this graduate didn't came a ready-made like coat kind of thing. So that's my roundabout answer.
Thank you. And we have another question, and it's from Anonymous. He or she is asking about, do you think that architecture education as well as practice will be changed in post-pandemic world?
Yeah, this is up in the air, it's very hard to respond. Like pandemic, it has, it has changed us psychologically, it has shown us our limitation kind of thing, but we are so adamant, we refuse to change, we think we're so good, we think we're so great, we can ride through all this thing, and we might, let's see how long this pandemic will linger on, and so far, we're ready to fight. I got COVID when hospitalized for 10 days, and doctor were like giving up on me, like kind of things. But when I was absolutely okay. But anyways, it has changed. For example, our office hour has shortened. We do it like 12 to 4, and we don't eat in the office. And so it has changed. We are really thinking of how to set up as an office in your home also, like so you have two office kind of thing. So we're thinking of all these things and we're making adjustment and improvement. So it will change, but we cannot see the future. It will definitely change. But we'll keep on designing building, I think.
So shall we move to the next question? Another question is, what is the main inspiring sector? I think the one is trying to write inspiring sector for newcomers, and how can we learn more and more? So I think he or she is asking about what is the main inspiring sector for the newcomers?
Inspiration. Inspiration is like the knowledge is free flowing these days, like when I was studying architecture, you could never imagine hearing Rem Koolhaas speak, even in video, early on there was not even video, when I was in Boston, I felt so great listening to all these world famous architect, and I felt, I'm so lucky, I'm gaining so much, I'm going to be a great architect because I've come and listened to them kind of thing. It's not like that, but, it is inspiring because these days, because the knowledge is so open and free flowing. If you want to improve, there is just no limit. There is no excuse to say, I don't know. If you say you don't know, I would say, go know it. Yeah. But what you'll do is you are comfortable with, I don't know. You don't want to go back and get to know it, right? So you have to look at your responsibility, how responsible you are being. I mean, you know what I mean? If you don't know something, if I point it out to you, you don't know this, will you go back and try to find out the answer? I guess not,
And the effort.
But we should be like that, So the inspiring is in our heart, get in touch with your heart, I guess.
Yeah.
Was there other second question to that?
No, sir, that's it, I think.
Okay.
If anybody have any more question, please, you can raise your hand or comment in the section. I think there are no more questions, so I think this is it. So thank you so much, sir, once again. It's been really inspirational one. So moving forward, I hope that everyone had their queries answered. And moving forward, now I would like to request our chairperson of SONA, Committee of Architecture Education, Architect Pradeep Adhikari, sir, to speak few words for us.
Thank you, Anushka. And thank you, Jayendra sir. It was a wonderful session with all your experiences, and there are lots of memories associated with your academics to many people, many even professional architects right now, or some of them are having a new kind of experiences with you, I guess. So it was a very energizing sessions I could find, or I could still remember. If I try to summarize it, I like the way you started your presentation with the memory associated with architectural elements, and you went on talking about some regional kind of perspectives, talking about the Nepal guns, the potteries there. So you were trying to be very meticulous with the artifacts and trying to relate your phenomenological kind of perspectives towards the different places, architectural elements, and your own experiences. Those were very interesting present, I would say. And meanwhile, your emphasis towards the vernacularity or place-related or place-based kind of spirits in architectures, while you talked about David Doberreiner's and the experiences related to him, and so on. Those were very, those are very interesting, and they could make us like aware about the regional kind of perspectives that the Kathmandu or the Nepalese architecture can have. And even your presentations, I was finding some of the longings towards the regionality or regionalisms that we could try, that could be very educational or very inspirative to the fellow architects and the young architects and students. And yeah, there were like similar kind of things. And finally you came up with some of your projects, and those were still interesting. I hope for all the learning students of who are still learning in the studio, who are doing studio in their institutions, those could be very inspirational, or those could be very educational for them, and even for the professional architects to those could be a kind of experience experience sharing, or finding some kind of insights from your own kind of experiences. So in that regards, I found or we all found your presentations very fruitful, very meaningful, and we are very thankful to you. And even like the subcommittee is very happy to start this wonderful journey from you as the first presenter, who and then and we I would also, on behalf of the subcommittee itself, I would like to assure all the attendees here that we will have more and more action-packed sessions, more discussions about the contemporaries, the theories, or some practice, some concerns related to some issues and concerns related to the architectural practice that we all are having in this town. And so this is, and I would like to assure you that, all of them, that this is just the beginning of a long journey. Thank you, Jendra sir, and thank you everyone.
Thank you so much, Pradeep sir, for your very kind and inspiring words. And thank you, Zaindra sir, once again for your time and valuable insights about state of architecture. Now it's almost come to the ending. Before leaving, I would like to thank SONA Committee of Architecture Education for organizing this productive event and giving us opportunity to be part of it. And now I would like to request our president of SONA, respected architect Rajesh Thapa sir, to join us and give us a sweet ending to this wonderful event. Thank you.
Thank you, sweet Anusha. That is well conducted. And good to see Jayendra, and I'd like to thank the committee where Pradeep and Sunita worked a lot and have been, responsible for starting this event. Anyway, Jayendra, the long live architecture, yeah, I like that. And you started with that and ended with that. Anyway, the way you came up with all the nostalgic memories of your small and simple environments that you grew up with, it was so different from where I began my my journey, because I grew up in the environment of the Georgian architecture, the English architecture, and my schooling also had the same type of habitat. A lot of large, buildings of reflection of the British Raj. Anyway, but you shifted on and went into the boldness of modern architecture. From very subtle beginnings, you went into this dynamic and very bold sort of your creations. And you gave a very good title to your identity, which was Flight of a Butterfly. I think all architects need to be identified, and probably that is a step that you took up. Yes, I wish most of the projects have taken off, because I remember also I did a lot of work in Manang, and one of the schools built at Humde is also very memorable, a health clinic and a school. But I'm sure your Gangapurna project must be very fascinating as well. Yes, one thing in architecture is when I was a student in Nagpur doing architecture in the 70s, I was, in fourth year, I was told that there are three types of architects that come out. One would be the quiet type, who would be in the design board. Those days we didn't have the computer, we had the drafting boards. So you would be on the drafting board. And that's the quiet type of architecture who would be mostly on those things. And then you have the other type who are going to be more, designing, but they will be always checking themselves, because you see, those days my school of architecture was in an engineering college, so you're more adapt to or more limited with the engineering philosophies as well. So those people are there who would go beyond the drawing board. But then there are other people, the third type of architects, who would be doing everything, a bit of everything, but they're the real managers. And this is where the professional people come in. I think this is what I like, and I've really changed myself. My architecture has changed that way. So I've become more a project manager. So I go into construction projects, I go into professional things. So architecture is all about this thing. So professional practice is something that really takes you to different levels. Anyway, getting jobs, and when I came back again, again, architecture, when you talk about architecture, I wanted to do something beyond architecture. So I went into Auroville. I think you must have heard about Oroville, and there it was a mix of all architects of different parts of the world. They were there, and I had a great chance to learn from them. And you know, so but my mother thought I was going astray, so my mama had to go to Pondicherry, Oroville, and pick me up and brought me to Nepal, and then I started my journey as an architect in Nepal. But before that, when I was a student, I still remember I worked in. I got I used to on summer holidays. I used to stay in, and try to in the beginning, the first 2 years up to third year, I think. I used to go to some of the offices in India, and one of the offices that I went twice to was the largest office in India, Kothari and Associates. They're the biggest office in India. They've got about 7, 8 branches. My perception going to the office was, I'm an architect. Maybe I'll do something. I'll be going to design or something like that. But then I realized I was just an apprentice, a second year student or first year student. So they told me, okay, Rajesh, why didn't you start sharpening pencils? That was my training. I started my training by sharpening pencils, and because we used to do drafting with pencils, no computers at that time. But then we built up, and unfortunately, I did my, like what you call intern these days. So I had a thing. I worked with Wise at that time, the oldest, one of the oldest architectural offices where most of us seniors have graduated from, and then suddenly I've explored into very big offices, very big projects, and one was the Russian embassy where we worked with, and as an intern, it was wonderful. And also, I remember the Yellow Pagoda Hotel and the Annapurna Hotel. Sorry, these 3 hotels I got a chance to work on. And the best part of it, I always have very nostalgic memories of my office then. It was in the Royal Hotel, the first hotel, formal hotel of Nepal, which is now the Election Commissioner's office. So that was the office we started off from. But then we moved on, and but let me say one thing: architecture has really grown these days, and like I see a very committed teacher in Jayendra who has come up with researches in his projects, and this is definitely will be reflecting on his students. And today we find a lot of architects, young architects, coming out with very bold architecture. In our time, when I started office in the 70s, we won competitions, we won this thing, and but our architecture was very simple. Still, because there was a lack of understanding of architecture, whether it's in private clients or even the government who would probably not understand. And the main thing was the economy. It was not there. But now I think people are beginning to spend on architecture, and that's why it'll grow, it'll change. And thanks to all of you, you're doing better. The first design competition which I won was long time. It's when I started off as 79, where again I think it was very simple. I think I still believe that I won it because of my smartness in knowing how to do design competitions, because I learned that in India, how to do design competitions, how to influence, with your work or presentations. But then lately, I think, very recently, I was associated with my young company, which I have grown up with also, taken them up, the 3 dots, and we won the design competition for the last building. Now that is a completely different thing. So you can see the architect changing, from Tribhuvan University thing project that we did in design competition, and now here, it's completely different. And this is what I think I see a lot of young people coming up with Jayendra's residences, his Thakali food shops. It's so inspiring. It's, these are things that I think when I see the attendance today, it's all young students. And I'm very happy, that they are there rather than us, because they are the future. And when you have a very inspiring guru who's talking about the architecture, the present and the future, beginning with the past, I think this is where you would, definitely learn from. And yes, SONA is, I believe that I think architects should be hired by performance rather than by anything else. You are to sell your services through your products, and your services are not on the design board, it is out there on the site. And this is where it should be seen. I would definitely advocate, I think, design competition, but here I think we need to combine the senior or the more established companies with younger ones, because I think the younger ones win the projects, design competitions. It is not because I think what Jayendra said is probably the older generation would feel embarrassed to be participating. No, it's not that. I think the younger people, they give more time. That is the only project that they go into, and they win the projects because they've done more research. I think the established architects use the experience but spend less time on research because of other commitments. So I'm sure this has been a very good opportunity for the younger generation, and kudos to the education subcommittee that we have, and Pradeep and Sunita. Thank you very much, and of course, I will, always welcome Jayendra to come in again and inspire the young people, and see that they really learn from you, and wherever you are teaching, I'm my best wishes, and I hope you'll be a very good inspiration. And thank you everybody for participating. And thank you, Anusha, again. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And
I think we have come to the end. Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Thank you all for
Thank you,
giving me
everyone.
this opportunity.
Thank you, sir. Now we have come to the end. Thank you, everyone. You have all been wonderful audience.